In this Elden Ring video, we're going to be talking a bit more about Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. We just put out a video a couple days ago about how to prepare for Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. And in that video, we discussed, where you can get into the DLC and the things that you need to do in order to get there, and why you might want to go on an existing character versus creating a new character, and why you might want to go on an existing character versus maybe going to New Game Plus. And just gave you guys a reminder or a refresher for those of you that hadn't played in a while, all the things that you kind of unlock as you play the game that if you go into the DLC straight away, you'll kind of be gimped without. However, in this video, I want to take a look at how to prepare for the DLC in a bit of a different way. So something that we didn't mention in the previous video that I saw a lot mentioned in the comments that I didn't think was super relevant to that video, but is definitely relevant to this video, is that there appears to be some sort of attack power scaling system in the new DLC area. Now, obviously, when you go into the DLC, you're going to want your build to be as strong as possible no matter what attack power system is in place, because that still gives you the best chance of succeeding. But there is apparently, from a Famitsu interview, Miyazaki saying that there's going to be some sort of new attack power system only for the DLC area, not for the base game, just the DLC area, that works similarly to the way it worked in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Now, if you remember in that game, as you beat certain bosses and offered their memories to the Sculptor's Idol, you would increase your attack power and therefore deal more damage. So theoretically, in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, it's going to have a similar system. We don't know the exact specifics of it. I'm not trying to make a specific guide on this is what you must do. And we will have specific build guides and specific guides covering these aspects later. But hypothetically, if it has a similar system to Sekiro, what that means is that you're going to have to complete content in order to make your character stronger. And my understanding of why this was done in the DLC area was to give you a similar experience when you're playing Shadow of the Erdtree that you had when you first played Elden Ring. When you first played Elden Ring, your character was not powerful. You didn't know where to go. Not every boss was equal. You ran into the tree sentinel, you got your butt kicked, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to come back later when I'm stronger. Well, most players, if you're like me, I just sat there and smashed my face into it for 3 hours until I beat it. But most players will just go, okay, this is a skill check. I'm not here yet. I'm going to go get better stuff and come back. And I think the reason it was done like this is so that you have a similar experience in the DLC, where like if you go to this boss over here, he absolutely kicks your butt, and you're like, you know what, I need to go get my attack power up via some item or progression, and then come back to him when it gets stronger. And it kind of gives you that exploration feeling where you can't just tackle and defeat every boss that you come to instantly with some way overpowered build. However, you can still make your character powerful, and there are things you can do to get your character ready for the DLC. Some of the things we already mentioned in the previous video, but these are different things and different way of looking at your build to see if it can actually handle this aspect, and maybe to sort of get around it a little bit if you do want to be powerful in the DLC. Again, this is not a proper guide, and there's still a lot of unknowns about how this system works. So a lot of this is hypothetical, but I think a lot of this will remain true just because of the way the mechanics of the game are, and I cannot see them being changed drastically in the DLC. So the first thing to consider is whether or not the system that's incorporated to, affect your attack power nerfs your attack power while you're in the DLC, or if getting an item or unlocking progression increases your attack power. So if you have a very busted build, right, and you walk into the DLC, if your attack power is not nerfed, you should still do pretty well. However, if your attack power is nerfed, that brings it down on par with pretty much any build, because, let's say you do 1,000 damage or have 1,000 attack power, but when you walk into the DLC, it becomes 100. Well, somebody who has 500 attack power and now that becomes 50, the gap between 50 and 100 is a lot less. So that would put a lot of builds on par with each other. Whereas if it buffed your attack power, there would still be a huge discrepancy. So if you have an already OP build and the DLC doesn't affect your attack power in a negative way, then it should still be fine. However, I have a feeling that that's probably not the case, and that there's going to be some sort of prevention from that happening because of the exact reasons I mentioned, that the exploration is intended for you to have a similar feeling to what you had when you first played Elden Ring. And if you could just walk in there with any busted build and clear everything, then they didn't do it correctly. So I think there's probably going to be some nerfing involved. Now, assuming that overpowered builds that rely on high attack power, skills, and spells in order to deal damage are all kind of nerfed down, and every build is kind of on par in that regard in terms of like an attack power output, there are things that still operate very fantastically despite having low attack power, and anyone who's done like a challenge run in this game on a low level will tell you that Bleed, Frostbite, Poison, Scarlet Rot are all extremely powerful when you don't have high attack rating, because their damage is affected by the health of the enemy and not your attack power. That means, in theory, assuming that Bleed, Frostbite, Poison, and Scarlet Rot all work exactly the same as they do now, and they have not changed the damage of these, if you go into the Land of Shadow and you have a Bleed, Frostbite, Poison, or Scarlet Rot build, even if your attack power gets taken down, but you're really reliant on those, you should still come out ahead of maybe some other builds that rely on attack power. Again, we don't know that for sure, but if you're still looking to go in there with a very strong build, you might want to consider that having those status effects might put you in a better position. The next thing to consider is stance damage. If the progression system that's being added only affects attack power and stance damage remains the same, more or less, kind of like we're assuming that status effects remain the same, then stance damage is a safe bet for a build going into the DLC. There are a lot of builds out there that have very high damage, but there are some builds that rely almost solely on stance damage and stance breaks in order to dispatch bosses. I have made several builds that rely on these things, using skills like Square Off, Unsheath, Nebula, Impaling Thrust, Lion's Claw, Glintblade Phalanx, or spells like Dragon Maw or Great Blade Phalanx, or even the Stone Barb Crack tier to further boost your stance damage or give you a lot of stance damage into bosses quickly so that they stagger and then you can do a critical strike, repeating this process over and over. Because even if your damage is nerfed because your attack power goes down, but if stance damage is not nerfed, you should still be able to employ that same strategy into bosses, making you powerful, while some other builds that don't rely on that won't be as powerful. And of course, if you have the best of both worlds and you have a stance damage build that also has Bleed or Frostbite, Poison, and Scarlet Rot on it, then you'd probably be really set with a build for the DLC. And maybe perhaps I will work on generating a couple builds like that before the launch of the game to give people the best possible setup. Now, it's possible more data will come out between now and then that disputes that theory, saying that, oh yeah, stance damage is nerfed too. Status effects are that bosses are really resistant to status effects, so even if they trigger, it's not regularly. You know, that might come out between now and then, but from what we know so far, status effects and stance damage should currently work the same. And two other things that I want to touch base on before we wrap up this video. The first is holy damage. A lot of people are speculating that holy damage might be a fantastic damage type in the Land of Shadow. Holy damage is arguably the worst damage type in the base game, and people are thinking maybe it'll be redeemed in the DLC because it's a Land of Shadow and Holy and Shadow kind of opposites, etc. So maybe it's a good damage type. Now, obviously, we don't know if that's the case. I think that would be phenomenal if it happened, in order to sort of make Holy damage at least kind of on par with some of the other damage types in the game, because currently a lot of early game bosses and late game bosses in the base game resist Holy damage. So it's not necessarily the best thing, but if they did that, that would be fantastic. And this kind of dovetails into my last point, which is that if you're starting a new game, a character, and you're trying to figure out like what you want to do, you want to be a lower level going into the DLC, but you still want to be strong, you still want to have a decent build, consider the Gargoyle's Black weapons if you're trying to make a lowish new character going in there. The Gargoyle's Black weapons not only do holy damage, which might be great, I don't know if it is, but it might be great, but they also have extremely high attack rating for weapons that have minimum requirements, meaning they're at minimum requirements. If you just have the bare minimum in strength, dexterity, and faith, most of the time that's what those weapons scale with, you still have higher attack rating than many other weapons in the game, the vast majority of weapons, as long as your stats are not higher, right? As you go higher in stats and you get higher in character level, a lot of the other weapons in the game tend to surpass them. But if you're just talking like you want to make a low-level character, get some points in vigor, get some points in endurance, get some points in mind, and meet the minimum requirements for a weapon and upgrade it and get in there, definitely keep an eye on those weapons because they're absolutely fantastic for low-level characters. And that is, of course, if you're still focusing on a character and you're not taking my advice on status effects or stance breaks, but you're still looking to make a really high attack power character and you want to see how that does in there, playing like most people are going to play, not taking my advice and just going in there with what they have, but want to get something done quickly, that would be a very good option. And one more thing that I forgot to mention before I wrap up this video is Spirit Ashes. We don't know how this new system will affect Spirit Ashes. It's not something I think a lot of players or every player thinks about. Not everyone uses Spirit Ashes, but will they be affected by this attack power change to the DLC area? Or will they be left alone for players to use them as they will? That's something we don't know as well. So if you are struggling in the DLC, you might want to consider, maybe I should use some Spirit Ashes to see how they do. Maybe you should look at the Spirit Ashes, kind of go through them now and see if there's ones that you like, complement your build very well, and maybe see if you can have them ready and upgraded for when the DLC drops. So that wraps up our video on how to further prepare for Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC coming out in June. Again, this is not a proper guide. I'm not telling you that you have to do these things or these are the best way to make a build in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. I'm simply saying that these are things that I've considered that you should consider based on the information that we currently have. And this is information that could change over time. And obviously, as that happens, I'll further advise what I think you should do with a character. But until that time, I think these are things that could work out really well for a DLC build. I want to know what you guys think. What do you guys think of this? My logic here. Is it sound logic? Am I off base? Is it just way too early to speculate? Let me know in the comments below.